Pleased to welcome you to our quarterly update, looking at the latest findings from Robert Half Job Confidence Index, which is in partnership with CEBR, which is the Centre for Economics and Business Research. So today we have Nina Skiro, who's the Chief Executive at CEBR, who will be going through the latest JCI data, followed by a Q&A which will be based off the back of the findings. So before I start, I'd like to share some of the reasons why we've commissioned this unique study. So while business and consumer confidence are regularly measured, analysing worker confidence through a macroeconomic lens and in the context of job creation, security and career progression can reveal deep insights into the state and stability of our labour market. Although traditional measures of our labour market, like unemployment, job vacancies, are very, very valuable, the figures alone are not enough to understand the UK's increasingly complex labour market. So this is why we have partnered with CEBR to create the quarterly Robert Half Jobs Confidence Index. So with that, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Nina Skiro from the CEBR. As the Chief Executive of CEBR, Nina is regularly interviewed on Bloomberg and the BBC. She also often presents her research at public events around the UK, also globally across Europe, Asia and the Middle East. Nina analyses, authors bespoke reports and comments as an expert on labour market trends. So we're delighted to have Nina with us. And I'm working on the Jobs Confidence Index. So with that, I'll pass over to Nina, who will walk through her deck.
Thanks very much, Gareth, and thank you also for the introduction. So before I delve into this quarter's results of the index, perhaps just a bit of a quick overview of what the work is, just for anyone who is less familiar with it or only becoming familiar with it now. So the index is a quarterly and therefore very timely measure, and it takes a very broad and robust view at jobs confidence and what is happening in the labour market. I think what makes it particularly useful to businesses and other stakeholders out there is just how many indicators we encompass within the research. So it provides a much more comprehensive look at the situation out there than something like the official labour market releases, which would usually be one very specific measure. So it's a very unique, very authoritative overview of the situations in the job market. And with that, I will just start sharing the results of the latest quarterly report. There we are. So we can see there the back history of the Jobs Confidence Index, as well as the most recent reading, which is for the third quarter of 2023. And what the Jobs Confidence Index has done is actually marginally declined compared to the second quarter. But as you can see, if you compare it to the back history, despite this decline, it's actually still quite positive. So each quarter, the value that the index takes on is sort of varies around the 0 mark. So you can take on both a positive and a negative value. So if it takes on a positive value, it means that it is higher than the long-term average. And if it is negative, it means that that quarter the reading is lower than the long-term average. So methodologically, there is actually no limit to how high or how low the reading can be, but just based on the back history, we say that the usual range is between positive 30 and negative 30. So this quarter's reading at 45.8, even though it is a decline from the previous quarter's reading of 47.2, that is actually still a very, very confident and very, very positive reading. So as I, oops, sorry, just let me. Sorry. So as I just said, yeah, we've seen this decline from 47.2 to 45.8, but overall index staying very positive. And if we just take a look at what are the components of that performance in the third quarter. So the index has 4 subcomponents. So what we look at is job security confidence, confidence around pay, people's confidence in terms of job search and progression. And then finally, the 4th pillar looks at broader macroeconomic indicators. And if we look at how those 4 subcomponents have changed in the recent quarter, so only one of them has risen, which is the search and progression confidence pillar, whereas the other 3 have declined. But similarly, as with the headline findings, despite the other 3 declining, they are actually not painting too negative of a picture overall, given that some of those declines were from a very high base. So looking at the search and progression pillar again, it is risen to its highest reading since the final quarter of 2019 and is now sits at 46.8. The job security pillar, again, despite declining, posted quite a strong reading at 107.3. Although that was a decline of 12.8 points from an even stronger reading in the second quarter. On pay confidence, we saw a decline of 5 points down to 28.5. And then finally, on macroeconomic confidence, we saw a decline from 3 to 0.8, although again, keeping in mind how much variability there is in the index and what the usual ranges are, although that is a decline in the macroeconomic confidence, it is sort of a broadly stable reading still, I would say. So next, if I delve a little bit more detail in terms of what each pillar is telling us, starting with the job security confidence. So this pillar would include measures such as the official measure of unemployment, the unemployment rate. We would look at labor market tightness, and it also includes a bespoke surveying element. So as I mentioned before, the job security pillar declined, but remained quite high after recording the strongest reading of the JCI 4 pillars for an 8th consecutive quarter. Something that I will point out is I mentioned that there is a bespoke surveying element to this pillar, which looks at how confident employees feel about their job looking 6 months ahead. And there was a small downtick in that bespoke measure, but it's overall still quite a strong reading. So last quarter, 60% of respondents said that they broadly felt confident about the prospects for the next 6 months. And this quarter, that figure went down slightly to 58.4, but still a pretty encouraging reading. And something that I think is really interesting to mention with this pillar in particular, and which underlies why I think JCI overall is a really unique and useful tool, is that some of the subcomponents or some of the indicators that go into this subcomponent come from the ONS's labor force survey, which some of you might have seen has been in the news, given that it's come under some attention for possible issues with accuracy. And actually, in the last month, there's been some delays in the release of the official data. So I think this really underscores why there is a need to have something like the JCI out there, which takes a much broader look at the situation in the job market, paints, an alternative and a complementary picture of the labor market as a whole, so that we have something to rely on and to inform our decision making when the official measures, such as the unemployment rate, perhaps have issues with sampling, like is happening at the moment. Moving on to the second pillar, which looks at pay confidence, and this pillar declined overall, despite an uptick in real earnings. So we've seen real wage growth accelerate in the third quarter to 1.4% year on year, which is 0.7 percentage points higher than in the previous quarter. And this uptick is a result of a substantial downtick in inflation, given that real wages are, of course, inflation adjusted. So despite this uptick in real earnings, the pay confidence pillar declined. And that was a result of the other components. So again, despite the upward trend in real earnings, the people's confidence around sort of earnings actually is showing some signs of wavering a little bit. And also, we've seen that a larger share of workers reported having unpredictable wages, which of course isn't very encouraging in terms of the overall confidence levels. We've also seen poor figures for pay variance across comparable occupations, which was another downward contributor to the overall downtick in the pay confidence pillar. And then moving on to the job search and progression confidence, which was the only of the four pillars to see a rise between the past two quarters. So the pillar climbed significantly by 14.4 points to reach 46.8, and that is actually its highest reading since the final quarter of 2019. So the core driver of this improvement was an uptick in career progression confidence, which is also a measure that is that comes from a bespoke surveying element that we do for the index. So looking at the results of that bespoke research, so 47.4% of the respondents in the latest wave said that they felt either confident or very confident about future career prospects and their ability to progress in their careers over the coming 5 years. And of that 47.4%, 14.6% felt very confident about their future prospects. And this was an uptick compared to the reading in the second quarter of 2023, when the comparable figure stood at 41.9%. Now, on the other hand, whilst that indicator of the job search and progression pillar improved, we also saw that there was more limited social mobility, which is something that in this index we measure by looking at access to higher professions dependent on education level. So this indicator worsened, which held back an even larger improvement in the overall pillar. And if we look at, finally, levels of economic inactivity and involuntary part-time worked, these increased marginally on the latest data. So that would, again, be sort of a downwards pressure on this pillar. Although it is worth keeping in mind that this measure is only updated up until July, and this is due to the difficulties from the ONS that I mentioned earlier, and in terms of their data that they are releasing that is based on the labor force survey. So that measure has not been as up to date due to those issues, but still overall, given that it's only one of the inputs into the pillar, the overall pillar tells a very, very current and I think reflective story of what we're seeing out there in terms of job search and progression picture. And then the final fourth pillar looks at sort of broader macroeconomic considerations. So there is a measure of both consumer confidence and business confidence. The measure of consumer confidence comes from the CBR YouGov consumer confidence measure, and then we look at our work with BDO as a measure of business confidence and business optimism. So strictly speaking, this measure declined from 3 to 0.8. But I mean, if you're sort of looking at that chart, it's a little bit hard to see that change just because both of the readings, both in the second and the third quarter, are so close to zero. Looking at first consumer confidence, the average reading in the third quarter was 100.6. So it's a very marginally optimistic, but basically neutral consumer sentiment outlook. And then looking at business optimism, again, it's stayed largely unchanged, increasing by just 0.4 points on the quarter, and it's actually broadly flat on the year as well, changing just 0.3 points. So overall, I would say, although the macroeconomic pillar has declined, it's really a sort of a chain. It's really a story of sort of a broadly unchanged level of confidence on the quarter for both consumers and businesses. And then, having reviewed the 4 sub-pillars, we take a closer look at the tech industry, for which we specifically consider a number of the indicators that I've just been talking about, and we look at basically how they have compared relative to the performance in the wider economy. So I would say a relatively mixed picture in terms of the indicators, but still, I think a lot of reasons for optimism in terms of the tech industry snapshot as well. So if we look at the first, starting with the measures that have improved, so we've seen annual earnings growth. Now, it's a little bit sort of important to take a moment to explain. So between the 2 quarters, quarter 2 23 and quarter 3 23, this measure has seen a significant uptick. But actually, the annual change in vacancies is one of decline. So basically, it's sort of, although a positive contribution to the reading, basically what's happened between the 2 quarters is that the number of vacancies is declining more slowly. But it's important to keep in mind that these are annual change figures. So a year ago, there was such an elevated number of vacancies that actually what we're seeing now is not at all a bad situation. It's just a return to longer running averages. So it's important to be cautious with those, quite negative figures, a rate of a 29.7% decline on the year. Again, that's just because the starting place was such a high level. And then, as I mentioned, annual earnings growth remaining quite strong, so and in fact increasing. So we saw annual earnings growth in the tech industry at 11.3%, and this compares to 7.4% across the wider economy. Now, even 7.4% for the wider economy is quite a strong reading. So the fact that it's even higher in the tech industry is really quite a strong reading. And then looking at the final measure, which saw an uptick between the final 2 quarters, which is labor productivity. And again, the situation in earnings growth is mirrored in what we see in productivity growth, in a sense that the sector is performing much better than the wider economy. So in the third quarter, annual labor productivity growth stood at 0.9%, which is essentially treble the rate for the wider economy of 0.3. And then two of the measures referring specifically to the tech industry, which saw a negative change between the second and the third quarter of 2023, is the share of temporary workers and also looking at pay fluctuation. So the share of employees with a temporary work arrangement rose by 1.1 percentage point and now stands at 5.5%, while the share of workers in the tech industry specifically that reported fluctuating pay increased to 7.7%. So these two would have been net detractors from the overall reading and the overall sentiment in the tech industry. So having taken a closer look at the tech industry, we take a look forward. Sort of what we can expect for the economy overall and how this can interplay with some of the inputs into the JCI. So the third quarter of 2023 basically saw economic growth flatlining compared to the previous quarter. And I think this really underlines what has been the case with the UK economy for a little while now, basically ever since that post-COVID growth boost started tapering off, which is a very sort of flatlining picture and very, very low rates of growth. In fact, in the third quarter on the year, GDP is estimated to have increased just 0.6%. This slowdown comes against the context of a few different headwinds. So the cost of living crisis, which came primarily on the back of the spike in energy prices, which then increased the cost of a lot of other essential items as well, and put a lot of households in quite a difficult situation. And then given that spike in prices combined with supply chain bottlenecks and also combined with very strong demand boost after the COVID restrictions were lifted. So this created a perfect inflationary storm, so to speak, which then caused the Bank of England to increase interest rates, which is now additionally choking off growth in an attempt to bring inflation under control. And it's important to keep in mind that although we've probably seen an end to the Bank of England's hiking cycle, that doesn't mean we've seen the end of the impacts of that hiking cycle on the economy. A really important transmission mechanism from monetary policy into the economy is people seeing a change in their mortgage rates. And there are still many households that are just now or are yet to roll off their fixed mortgage payments and really be exposed to these higher interest rates. So in terms of the GDP forecast, we're expecting that 2023 as a whole will have seen GDP increase by 0.5% and then an even lower 0.4% in terms of our growth forecast for 2024. In terms of what this could mean for the labor market, so the labor market has actually remained quite robust despite a downtick in some of the other measures of economic activity that I've just mentioned. So we are actually currently seeing unemployment at just 4.3%. But it is, of course, important to keep in mind that unemployment is a lagging indicator. So you would expect to see some delay between a wider economic slowdown and an uptick in the unemployment rate. And because of this, and because of the continued trajectory of very low growth, we are expecting a peak in the unemployment rate of 5.2% in 2024. So we are expecting a little bit of a softening on that measure, although historically speaking, that is still not a too high of a rate of unemployment. And then correspondingly, we are expecting these developments to be reflected in vacancy numbers, which we are expecting to soften a little bit. But this softening will come on the back of some very, very high figures that we've seen recently. So even after a softening in vacancy figures, we're actually expecting a relatively robust picture there. So I will leave it there, but I'm of course, Gareth, happy to take any questions you might have.
Oh, fantastic, Nina. Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. The quarterly index is it has certainly moved on. So look, we've got some time for a few questions. So firstly, how do you define confidence as an economist, and how important is confidence in business growth?
Well, I think the best way to think about confidence is also probably the simplest one, which is it's basically a measure of how people feel, how optimistic they are about various elements of both the present and the future, or the opposite side of that, how pessimistic they might be in terms of their outlook. And why this is important to business growth, to economic growth, is that if people are feeling optimistic, if they're feeling good about the future, about what's to come, they will spend more, they will generate more demand for goods and services. This will have a knock-on impact on business confidence. We would then expect to see businesses feeling more confident, being willing to invest more, to hire more, which then in its own right boosts economic growth. So I think it's quite an important measure because it has a very sort of looped way of confidence breeds more economic growth.
Yeah, and we're Nina, we're certainly seeing that as we come to the end of the year, and the end of the fiscal year. Then we are seeing far more confidence with regards to businesses as they look to business plan into 2024. So okay, thank you for that. So looking at the results, in which ways do you think that this continues to be a unique economic and labour market cycle?
I think it is a very unique point in time, indeed. So fortunately, there aren't a lot of pandemics out there, and I would still I think we're still seeing a lot of the dynamics of that sort of unwinding of the pandemic, and then that really big surge in demand after COVID. And I think that's still a really important element for where we are in the labor market cycle right now. So in the UK, a lot of people were expecting a very immediate and very negative shock to the labor market after Brexit. And Brexit certainly has had an impact on the labor market, but there wasn't that very immediate and very noticeable shock that some would have expected, partially because it took such a long time to actually sort of resolve Brexit. But then that shock that we didn't see immediately after Brexit, we did see more so during the pandemic. A lot of people left the UK and then didn't return in those same significant numbers. And there might be an sort of element of sort of COVID impacts mixing with Brexit impacts. Would more people that had left in the early stages of COVID returned? If it wasn't for Brexit, it's hard to put a number on it, but probably. So I think already that combination of Brexit, quite an unprecedented change in the structure of the economy, combining with the pandemic impacts, quite a unique situation. But I will say, on the bright side, there does also seem to have been a bit of a decoupling from what the labor market is doing and what the wider economy is doing. So even if we account for a little bit of a lag, it's interesting in itself that the labor market has done so well despite quite anemic economic growth.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Very, very good. And look, there, we are. we are still, in times of economic uncertainty. So, what would you put down as the reasons for high job confidence when, as I said, we are, still in times of economic uncertainty?
Well, simply, it's a very tight labor market, and anybody starting, thinking about how confident they are in their own employment situation, I think they would start there, and then considerations about how the wider economy is doing would only come as secondary. But it will of course depend by industry, by level of seniority, by region, by a lot of factors. But generally speaking, for most people, if they are looking for a job, they're still seemingly going to find a lot of good opportunities out there. So I think in that sense, people are feeling quite confident, and that'll be the main thing they're keeping in mind, more so than something like, what is the GDP trajectory.
Yeah, yeah, and look, our report talks about 44,000 open vacancies in tech. Each vacancy represents a potential missed opportunity, possibly. How much do you think that this is skills shortages induced?
I think a good component of that does have to do with skill shortages. So two particular points that I would mention, and that I think relate to the tech space in particular. So one is that I think the nature of progress and development in the tech space means that you tend to have a lot more very quick leaps that you might not see in other industries. And this would, for example, we've been looking at AI and just how much progress has been there in that field in the recent year. So you would have developments in the tech space creating quite strong demand for workers. And then that sort of supply of workers that are skilled in the particular set of skills that you would need would come online more slowly than the demand would the uptake. So there is that little mismatch in time, which I think is contributing to that quite high figure in terms of open vacancies. And then the second consideration I would mention that is true for a lot of industries, but I think especially so for tech, is that it is a global labor market. There is quite a lot of remote roles. It tends to be filled with job candidates that are quite mobile internationally. So it's also important for businesses in the tech space to be competitive amongst each other for labor, but it's also important for the UK to be competitive as a country, given that there are skill shortages and that people are very in demand that do have the right skills.
Yeah, absolutely, and we're seeing as well, that candidates are less inclined to move at the moment. So as with that, the knock-on effect of that is that that skills shortage deepens. So yeah, very interesting. And look, we've got time for one more. So it's great to see a rise in the real wage, 1.4%, which is 0.7% higher than the previous quarter. So what I would ask is, the growth has recently outstripped UK inflation. So what is CEBR's prediction going forward for the likelihood of further wage growth?
Yeah, so as you say, sort of it's in terms of how people feel about their wages. It's important both how their earnings are changing and what inflation is doing. So on the looking at inflation, we are expecting it to continue ticking downwards in 2024, and by the end of next year, by the end of 2024, to be sitting around the 2.5% to 3% range, which is still above target, but it is also a significantly lower than the rates we're seeing at the moment. And then in terms of wage growth, we are expecting wage growth to sort of a little bit come off the boil, I would say, over 2024. And actually over 2024, sort of it might seem as a percentage, relatively significant declines from the rates seen in 2023. But given how high wage growth has been in the year behind us, even that lower level would still be around 5.5%. And again, marrying that up with the downtake in inflation, that would still mean some very healthy real wage growth figures. So although I think some people have seen such high pay rises in the year behind us that it's perhaps left a little bit less room for equal rise in 2024. Overall, it's a very strong picture, and that's also what we've seen in the latest JCI. It's overall, important to look at the details, but at the highest level, a very robust picture, and that is also reflected in our forecasts for wages.
Okay, thank you. Well, fantastic. So look, Nina, that's all we have time for this quarter. For everybody, please take a look at the report, which you can find on our Robert Half website. If you'd like to discuss any of the findings, then please get in touch with us. There will be another webinar in a quarter's time when the indicators will almost certainly have changed. So that leaves me to just say, look, thank you very much, Nina, and the team at CBRE. CEBR. We value your partnership greatly, and we look forward to our next quarterly catch-up.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you very much for the trust you put in us in producing the index, and looking forward to another quarter in not too long.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth.